Okay, so this week we're going to do another still life, but this time we're going to change the setup. We're going to set up a still life based on a complementary color scheme, which you can see with this still life. I've got orange and blue as the complementary. And one thing I want to mention, I don't remember if I mentioned this last week, not as big of an issue for last week's still life, but it will be a bigger one as we go forward. When you're thinking of setting up a color scheme, especially with a complementary color scheme like we have today, it's really good and important to think about a dominant and a subdominant color within that color scheme, meaning there's one that's more pronounced and one that's more of an accent. So in this particular color scheme, you can tell the orange is much more the pronounced dominant color, and the blueberries are the subdominant. Okay, so there's kind of a balance between one versus the other, as opposed to having equal amounts of the colors you're using in your color scheme. You don't want to overdo it and just crowd it out, because if you have equal amounts of each color in your color scheme, more or less, you end up with some chaos going on. Another thing, and again, it's not as big an issue as it is on this one as it will be for the one we do next, the next assignment coming up later. If you just because you have a certain color scheme in mind does not mean you can't have other colors. For example, I've got this orange and blue in this color scheme. That doesn't mean I couldn't have a color scheme that has some objects that are colors that are different than orange and blue. Just the overall overriding dominant color organization is based on orange and blue complements in this particular example. All right. I'll get more into that when we get to our next still life, which is going to be a little more intricate than what we're doing right now, but we're still trying to keep with basic shapes. So I'm using orange and blue as my color scheme. If you want to set up objects that are different complementary colors, that's fine. Red and green, yellow and violet, that's up to you. If you're not sure about your setup that you've done, email me a picture. I'll send you back a response. So like before, I'm going to do a drawing. Then we'll get into the painting. And like last week, we will use a limited palette, but we're going to use a different limited palette this week than last time. We're going to use yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, and Prussian blue. All right. And if you didn't get alizarin crimson, quinacridone rose was the alternate option for that. So I have quinacridone rose here, but I'm not going to use that one. If you have quinacridone rose and you want to use that instead of the alizarin, that's fine. But I'm going to use in this demo the alizarin, the Prussian blue, and the yellow ochre. Right? And I'll talk more about the colors as we get to it. But first, I'm going to deal with the drawing. Right? So I'm not going to do anything that we haven't already done. Just lightly, I'm using an HB pencil, lightly blocking in the underdrawing. So what I might do as part of this demo, which you're probably going to see here in a second, I might just speed up the video just so you don't have to sit through the drawing again. If you want to see a slowed down version of this drawing, I will have a version of it available. Just let me know and I'll send you the link to it. But again, I'm not doing anything here that I haven't already done in your previous demos. I'm measuring, and obviously the image is up here, but my still life is actually over there, so that's why I'm measuring over there. And I've set up again to where I block the light that's hitting this so it doesn't interrupt the still life. Okay, so this section of the video I just sped up just for sake of time, so you don't have to sit through another 15 minutes of drawing. It picks up again in real time in just a second. But I'm just doing the same thing I always do, measuring, making sure my drawing's really solid, just working from big to small, specifying the shapes as little by little. So in just a few seconds we'll get back to normal, but just wanted to let you know what happened here. I'm not really drawing this fast. Alright, so we got the drawing down. It took about 14 minutes, 15 minutes roundabout. If it takes you much longer than that, that's fine. One quick note I want to give about setting up your still life. You know, something you can do if you feel like you want to spend a good amount of time on the drawing and then take a break and come back and work on the still life later. If you're using something like I'm using, which is basically, you know, vegetables, which or fruit in this case, which I don't want to leave out because obviously they're gonna go bad if I leave them out. You can put them on a tray when you put down your still life, and then just carefully put them back in the refrigerator. If you're choosing to do something that's vegetables or fruit for your still life, that way you can spend a lot of time on the drawing and then come back to the painting when you're ready. Just make sure you have the lighting set up exactly the same as when you were drawing. Otherwise, it's going to cause you trouble. All right. So a few little things I want to finish up in here. And like I was saying, you know, the stronger your drawing is, the easier the painting is going to be. So spend extra time with the drawing. I know, like I said in the thing before, sometimes a big problem with people, and when it comes to painting in any medium, is they're so eager to get to the color. They're so eager to put down paint that they blast through the drawing, and then that ends up causing a bunch of unneeded frustration in their painting. And then they think to themselves, "Oh, I'm just not good at painting." Well, the reality of it is, it's not that they're necessarily bad at painting. It's that they spent so much time. They just rushed to the painting and they didn't think of the drawing, that really their problem is rooted in a drawing issue, not so much a painting issue. So spend that extra time when you're drawing. Okay? No shame in doing that. And like the previous assignment, we're going to do 2 setups. I'm doing this on cold press paper, but you're going to do one painting on hot press, one painting on cold press, and it's going to be a complementary setup. And I would say have a minimum of 3 objects. Obviously, I've got more than 3 objects here with all the berries, but one thing I want to point out about these berries, if I didn't say it before, I'm not treating them as just general circles. I'm giving them all individual, very careful attention to their shapes relative to everything else, okay? So, let me get some paper towels. And the other thing I'm going to do in this demo that I did not do in the last one is I'm going to show you how to incorporate the watercolor pencils into a watercolor painting. That's going to come more towards the end. And remember, that's only optional. You did not have to get watercolor pencils. If you didn't get any, that's fine. You don't have to do it. I just want to show you how to do it for those of you who decided to get some. It's just an option. But again, that's not till the end. So anyway, so I've got my drawing down, measured out the proportions, used an HB pencil. Everything's laid in. Now I'm going to, like last time, I'm going to start with my big brush. And this is the only brush that you have, that's fine. No problem with that. So I don't lose these. I'll just keep them right there to the side. And like before, I'll change out the water as I find it's needed. So I get my brush wet. Get out the excess water. Just, you know, in my brush, in my paper towel like I showed last time. And we're using yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, and Prussian blue. And I want to do a quick example. And let me put down a little bit of a border for our mixing area, or for our test area, like we just talked about with the last assignment. So I'm going to have this area as my test area. Okay. Alright everybody, I just realized as I recorded this video that the first section of the video that you're about to see, where I start blocking in paint, that the camera for some reason wasn't on for the first 15 to 20 minutes of me mixing up some colors. So I want to just quickly, I didn't do much in the 20 minutes, but I do want to quickly explain some things just in case this first section feels a little bit confusing. So this painting we're using yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, and Prussian blue. So when I talk about mixing the orange, just as a quick example so you understand what you're about to see, there's my yellow, remember always blot out paintbrush, there's my alizarin, and my alizarin has an undertone towards purple, which means there's some blue in it, so that's why we're going to get a neutral orange. So when I mix them, you see this is the orange that we're making. Obviously we're not going to get an orange like that, but as you watch the rest of this demo, you'll see that we don't really need to for this context. So don't be thinking in that term of an orange. We're using a limited palette for this. So yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, and Prussian blue, or if you don't have Prussian blue, phthalo blue would work, or quinacridone rose would work in place of the alizarin if you don't have it. But this is the orange that I'll be referring to, and like I say, in about 15-20 minutes, the video of the palette picks up again. For some reason, the first section just didn't get recorded. I'm not sure why, but that's how I'm mixing that orange. And it's already kind of neutral, so when I say I'm adding touches of a blue to neutralize it, you know, here's my Prussian blue. So it touches like that until I get the mixture I want, until I neutralize it the way I want. And then obviously we can mix our Prussian and alizarin to get kind of a violetish color. Obviously it's going to be a little bit dull because there's an undertone of green to this Prussian blue and to the phthalo blue. Again, whichever blue you're using, whether Prussian or phthalo. But that's listed in the email, your colors. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that. Those are the colors we're mixing from, just so you know. And like I say, in about 15 to 20 minutes into this video, the palette does pick up. Just for the first section, for some reason, the video didn't record. So I just wanted you to be aware of that, okay? So I'm using yellow ochre and alizarin crimson. And again, you can use quinacridone rose if you didn't get alizarin crimson. That's fine. They're both cool yellows. I'm sorry, they're both cool reds. So there's my alizarin. There's a reason I'm having you use these specific colors for this assignment. It's an exercise in a certain issue that I'm going to talk about here in a second. I just want to make sure I get all these colors down so you can see them. There's my Prussian blue. And if you don't have Prussian blue, phthalo blue would work. They're both blues that have a shift with an undertone of green. So a quick refresher about the pigments, the undertones of these pigments, and what's going to happen. The alizarin crimson shifts towards the violet direction, which means there's some blue in it. The yellow ochre is already kind of a neutral color to begin with. So if I mix an orange out of yellow ochre and alizarin crimson, I'm going to get a neutral orange. So somebody might ask, well, the orange in the still life looks in some areas relatively intense. Remember though, it's about the relationships we create in our painting. It isn't that we're trying to do this photographic match of our subject matter. So as long as I can make sure that the more intense areas of my image in my final painting end up reading as more intense relative to some other areas of the painting, then that's what we're going for, because we're going for the relationships of areas and how they work with one another, not necessarily this photographic match. And that's really what's going to help build the understanding of color a lot more clearly, is if you're thinking about relationships as opposed to thinking about photographic matches. Okay, and if you want to be a graphic designer, animator, illustrator, any of those things, that's really what that's based in, is understanding color relationships. All right, so that's number one. So I'm going to do a quick mixture to get an orange, just to show you what I mean. So there's my yellow ochre, and I mix in some alizarin. Now alizarin has a higher tinting strength, means it's much more powerful when it mixes in than the yellow ochre. So just underneath the two, be a little bit more yellow, or a little bit more alizarin. So there's the orange I'm getting. Not a super intense orange, but if I key that as my most intense orange, and every orange I mix after that goes a little bit more neutral than that, then this orange will, in the context of the painting, appear to be the most intense orange. Let me show you what I mean by that. So here's my orange. Blue is the complement of orange, and alizarin already had an undertone towards blue because it has violet. But let's say I take this mixture, I'm going to pull just a little bit of it over here, and I add a touch of the blue into it. Put that next to this. And you'll be able to see this in the example image that I sent you of this demo. You can see now this doesn't look as intense as what I just mixed there. So it's all relative, okay? So I'm going to take actually some more of this and we'll paint it around that orange I just put down earlier. Just to show you what I mean. And like I said before, you know, gaining these issues with this understanding of color takes practice. So if the last painting that you did, you know, you just hated it, it didn't work, don't worry about it. I mean, we're going to do more and get better at it. So I don't expect you to master color in one painting, which is why we're doing so many of them. Just adding touches and touches of this Prussian blue. Now Prussian blue shifts with an undertone of green. So there's already some red in here because of the alizarin, so that's what helps make this even more of a dull orange. Now let me put this around the orange that I just had. Now the most intense area is appearing to be that, which was the orange that I initially mixed. Okay? And that'll become more clear as I do this bigger painting. But my point is, I always have to think in terms of the relationships of what I'm mixing, not in terms of a photographic match. You start doing that, then you're not really thinking about color relationships and how color is functioning. And I don't want you to misunderstand how color works. Color can be, people can easily make it more complicated than it is, and I think in some cases people can oversimplify it and make it seem like it's easier than it is. It's certainly not easy. There's that mixture again of just the alizarin and the yellow ochre. So you can tell that looks a little more intense than what I've got there. And the blueberries, obviously, I'll talk about those when we get to those. But anyway, I just want to do a quick example of what that means and take that excess out. So I'm going to start like I did before in the generally speaking the lighter areas, and I'll work my way towards the darker areas. I say generally speaking because like with the last painting, there's always little exceptions we can find. I'll talk about those when I get to those. So I've got a light area here. These blueberries seem even darker than some of this shadow. I can see some of that red, or that orange rather, reflection into the shadow here. A little bit cooler part of the shadow here. I've got a warm light on the still life, but because we have this reflected area that's bouncing off of the orange into the shadow there, you can tell this part of the shadow is slightly warmer relative to this part of the shadow. And the area of the shadow here that's warmer than this part is not as warm as, say, obviously these direct light areas up here in the orange. So I just wanted to point those out. Those are the things that are going through my mind as I start thinking about mixing. So I've got the area here, which is the white part of that orange, which is actually has a little bit of a warmth to it. So I'll do a very thin wash of just yellow ochre. I want it to read as warm, but I also want to make sure it reads as a light valued part of my subject. And considering that I'm going to put orange there, I think I'm just going to do a wash of this really thinned out yellow ochre over this whole area. Yeah. And obviously it's going to dry a little bit lighter, so it'll be almost the value of the paper, but not quite. It'll have a touch of a warmish tinge to that white, which is what I'm wanting. Like I said during the color lecture, white doesn't really exist. There's always either a warm or a cool slant to it, depending on how the light's coming down. I'll do something similar to the two little pieces of the peel right there. Obviously I'm going to paint over this further just to get it in the ballpark of being warm. And if I think I'm going to paint something wet into wet, then I will test it, or if I'm not sure about how it's going to work, there's probably some areas of wet into wet I'm going to do here. I'm going to mix up a little bit of a yellowish orange I'm going to take this yellow ochre and touches of the alizarin. And this I want it to dry before I go into there because there's a pretty clear division of areas. So I think I'll put in drop in some wet into wet here because it's still wet and I see some subtle transitions. Certainly see some here as well. I talked about this earlier, but you'd be surprised at some of the paintings throughout history that were done with extremely limited palettes. Prior to the mid-19th century, there was only a few colors available. Cadmium colors hadn't even been manufactured prior to the mid-19th century. So a lot of the colors on your palette, or the ones you go to the store and see, a lot of the master artists didn't even have access to those because those weren't even being made. So, historically speaking, artists have gotten by with minimal colors, and that's because they studied the issues of color theory and how color functions very carefully. Not quite ready yet. So while that's drying, I'm going to go into that in a minute. I think I'm going to mix up a warm blue to get these blueberries started. And as I do that, I notice parts of the shadow here on some of these cast shadows of the blueberry have a little bit of that reflecting orange in them. So I think I'm going to have an orange mixed up ready to go, and as I wash into the shadow, I'm going to drop in wet into wet some of those reflected areas of the orange. And the Prussian blue is a warm blue to begin with. So I might just add a tiny touch this orange mixture to it, but it doesn't need to be much. In just a few minutes I'll probably clean out my cups with fresh water, but I'm going to get this kind of blocked in first. And remember, work as slow as possible. I mean, obviously in some cases it's not possible to go super slow because of drying issues and wet into wet applications that you might want to do, but as much as you can. That's again why it's so important to test things if you're not sure about it. It gives you a sense on how much working time you might have for any given idea that you're looking to do or looking to apply. This is just the first pass on the blueberries as well. I want to give them as much attention in terms of color, value, all of those issues that I do to the orange, even though they are not the dominant part of the image. They're a strong support, but clearly the focal point is the orange. I could say it's the lead character if this was, an illustration of a narrative or something. I see a little bit of reflecting orange in here, so I'm going to wash in this blue, and I've already set up in mind, I'm going to immediately drop in. I've thinned out the brush a little bit with just water, just to pull this over, and I'm going to drop in some of that orange to get that reflection while it's still wet. I'll leave it there and let it dry, and I'm going to move on, and we'll go back and reassess that later. So always try to think of this. I've said this in the drawing classes before. I think it's even more important for painting. Always try to think of your painting almost like a game of chess. You're trying to think a few steps ahead. You're doing this with the intention of later doing that. So everything you're doing is a setup to the next thing you're going to do. It is think of everything you're doing as a start, not a finish. I'm doing this with the intention of later on setting me up to do that, or do whatever, value shift, temperature shift, whatever the case may be. So here I see another area that I need to drop in. So I'm blocking this in with the intention as a setup to block in that little wet into wet mixture in the shadow where I see the orange has a reflecting color. coming in there. It highlights there on the blueberry, but it doesn't have a razor sharp area, so I'm just cleaning my brush out. It has nothing but pure water in it, and I'm just going along the edges of that spot. I'll leave it like that for it to dry, and then we'll again reassess later. Not really much reflection of the orange here, but there is there. So I think what I'm going to do, again, I want to kind of explain my thought process here. This blueberry is clearly a more intense blue than any of the cool bluish tones in the cast shadow. But this cast shadow of the blueberry merges into the cast shadow of the orange. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up my intense blue that I'm going to put in for the blueberry, which will be mostly the Prussian blue with maybe a tiny bit of the orange. And then I'm going to mix up a neutral blue that I'm going to immediately pick up on after I blade in the blueberry and let that go into the shadow here. And then right in this spot, I'm going to end up dropping in the reflected orange, which you can see that's being reflected off of that orange into the shadow there. So I'm going to mix up a few things as a setup. So this blue right here could probably go for the blueberry, so I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to mix up a neutral, more neutral blue over here, which will be the larger part of the cast shadow to the left of the orange. Just mixing in some of this orange mixture. Proportionally more blue because I want to keep it cooler. If I mix too much orange into this neutral, it's going to make it too warm. So I've got a more dull mixture next to the more intense mixture. And then I want to refresh that orange that I'm going to use as my wet in the wet drop-in. And if you have to, I mean, granted, right now I've done a lot of watercolor painting, so I can come to these decisions a little bit quicker maybe than somebody who's never done watercolor before. If you need to slow yourself down and think out your strategy, that's fine. Realize the more you get into the habit of doing that, the faster you're going to get at understanding things, and eventually you won't have to slow down as much. In the beginning you will, but it's okay. So I know this can be tedious sometimes, having to stop and think about all these things you're going to do, but the more you do it, the faster you get. Like I said before, it's sort of like an athlete. The more they practice something, the better they get at it, the faster they get at it. Like a musician practicing piano or violin or guitar or whatever. I'm going to block in the more intense blue and the blueberry, then I'm going to go to that cast shadow here mixture that I had, and then I'm going to drop in my warm wet into wet mixture that's reflecting into the cast shadow. As far as using the colored pencil, I haven't even come to the determination yet of what I'm going to do with them. I'm going to let the painting tell me what it needs later on. In other words, I'm going to assess it later in this, once everything is really worked up, and then make a decision on what areas could use colored pencil and why, and I'll explain why I'm using them when I get to it. But that aspect is far off, so I haven't even thought about that yet. So that's my intense blue. Now I'm going to take off again, blot out the excess watercolor, go into my neutral mixture. And this area right about here, as I get closer to that orange, is where the reflection's coming in, and some right there as well. So I've already set up in my mind what I'm about to do, drop in that warm orange reflection. There's that orange reflection. Just dropping it in right there. Some of it's coming into there. And again, I've got this positioned at an angle to me. This is not flat on a table. This is at a relative 45-degree angle to me. And I'm just taking up some of it right here because I don't want it to bleed into this blueberry. So I'm taking out the excess right in this spot, and then knowing I can always paint back over this area later. Also know this is going to dry lighter. There's my orange wet into wet mixture. It's much more pronounced on this area than it is over here, but been a little bit more. Touch there. I'm going to let that dry before I do anything else. Now I'm going to move on to here. And actually, you know what? I'm going to pause just for a minute to change the water because that needs to be changed, alright? Alright, so I've changed out the water, and now I'm going to just continue what I was doing here. I'm going to block in some of the blueberries over here. Again, I'm going to pull from that more intense blue that I had over here with only a tiny touch of the orange. And knowing that all that I'm doing right now is a first pass, I'm going to, obviously alter, adjust, add, more as this painting goes along. So I'm not getting too stressed about going over it once and wanting it to look perfect. It's a whole process to making paintings work. It's not instant. And I'm going to switch to my smaller brush here in a minute. I'm going to do a little bit to the orange and then switch to it. Generally, you could say I'm doing somewhat of a flat wash, but I'm not being too picky about it because I know there's gradations here. The other thing I want to emphasize again is that I'm not thinking in terms of local color. Even though I'm putting this blue down, I already assessed, well, was this a warm blue? Was it a cool blue that needed to go in the light area of these blueberries? Was it more intense? Was it more neutral? So I'm not just going, oh, it's blue, let me just put blue down. I'm thinking, what kind of blue do I need given my situation? Given the setup that I'm working from, the type of light that I have on the setup, is it warm, is it cool, is it neutral, is it intense? So if I give you the feedback of the color seems too much like local color, basically what I'm getting at is that it probably needs to be more attention to the dimensions of color within any given area or subject. I'm not just thinking flat blue. In this setup, I've got a blue in the light area. It's relatively more intense than some of the other areas, and it's warmer. It shifts in the green direction, although it's still very much obviously a blue because these are blueberries. As I get to the shadows, I'm going to go back to that neutral mixture for the rest of this, because these shadows here are more of the neutral blue, which I'm going to pull from for there. As it blends into the shadow. I want to make sure I keep, in this area, the shadows certainly are much cooler than what was happening around that orange. Cool it off by adding a touch of alizarin to it. It also makes it neutral. Again, alizarin is a red. Red is the complement of the undertone of the green that's in this warm blue. Leave that there, and I'll assess if any changes need to come to these areas after I have other areas blocked in more. So So none of the things I've done here have I thought of, oh, they're perfect, I'm going to leave them as is. Well, I'll kind of have to wait and see as I progress ahead. Constantly keep comparing. I put this down, I put that down, and what has that created? What kind of relationships do I have in my image relative to what I'm seeing in my setup? And what adjustments do I need to make further? Does it need to be warmer, cooler, lighter, darker, whatever? And I hate to be repetitive. I know that I'm saying things over and over again, but you know that's the way you're going to get it in your head is if you hear me say it over and over again. I see another reflected orange in that shadow there, so I'm going to take the same approach I did over here. Go to that neutral, and then I'm going to drop in the orange reflection while it's wet. Clean out my brush. Drop in that orange. It's reflecting in. I'll leave it, and I'm going to do a little bit of that there in that cast shadow. Certainly has even more of an orange reflection. And that's based on this current setup. I changed the direction of the light source, but I leave the objects the same positioning. Maybe I have a completely different situation. So yes, it is based on the objects have these certain colors, but it's also based on how I set up the light, what type of light is hitting it, the direction it's coming from, what's it bouncing off of. And I get to those things little by little. I don't try to juggle every single thing at once. I prioritize. I need to deal with this now, and then the other little things I'll deal with later. I think that goes to another problem people have in their paintings. They sometimes try to juggle everything at once. Same thing happens with drawing a lot of times. People try to juggle too many things at once. Prioritize what's more important, deal with that now, and the other things that are also important but maybe not as imperative, deal with those when you get to them. Because everything you do is leading into a result of something else. So what I'm doing now is going to lead into the result of my decisions of what I do later. Every time I go here to clean out my brush, I always come back and I'm blotting it out here. So in case you don't see me pulling my hand up, that's what I'm doing when I go clean it out. I always blot it out at the excess water as needed. Again, if I'm not sure, I just do a test of the color I'm mixing. See if I've blotted out enough or if I need more water. So now I think I'm going to deal with the shadow here, and then we're going to get into that orange there. And we're going to get into some of what's happening over on this side. So here I have probably the most area of the shadow with the most reflecting orange. So I'm going to get some of this neutral blue. That part of the shadow is not quite as dark as some of the others either. I'm thinking ahead on what I need to do to make what I'm looking for. Got my neutral blue, a little more water in this mixture than the other ones because it's going to be a little bit lighter. If I need to do a second pass, I'll do that. I'm going to make up an orange mixture over here. And using a limited palette like we've done last week and what we're doing with this one, it just builds your abilities with color, even though it can be frustrating. So we will get to a full palette painting coming up soon. First blotting out again. I'm going to put down this shadow in that area, and then wet into wet, I'm going to mix drop in that orange. The reason I'm dropping it in wet into wet is I can tell there's soft gradations in it. So it logically would make sense to do it wet into wet as opposed to just hard direct mixtures on top. I probably wouldn't get the relationships that I'm seeing. Just dropping a little yellow ochre wet into wet into the alizarin area to warm up that orange just a touch. I'm going to drop in a little bit of a violetish mixture, neutral violetish with the Prussian and the alizarin mixed. Just taking up the excess with the brush. Brush, you could say right now, to pick up that little bead is almost acting like a sponge, just picking it up. So we'll let that dry. Now I'm going to go back into here, and then we'll get into this part of the art. And then just in a second, I'll probably transition into my smaller brush. I'm trying to stay with large brushes as long as possible. It helps me kind of get large areas taken care of, and it also helps prevent from getting bogged down on tiny little things. Sometimes if you start with too tiny of a brush, it can make you get bogged down on little things. Just going to put in a warm area right there. I'm going to clean off the palette as well. Okay, so now the palette's cleaned off. Blot out my brush again, my paper towel. And I see a warm orange here, which means orange with more yellow. And then we have the area we washed in there, which is going to serve as that white area part of the orange. So I'm going to, actually before I go to that, I think I'm going to wash in here with the big brush, then I'm going to go to my small one. Here we have an orange. It's a little bit cooler, it means it's shifting more towards red. We do have that reflection there, so I'm probably going to wash in the orange in here, and then the area that has slight bits more of red, I'll go wet into wet on top of that. And I have a little bit of this cool kind of tone probably coming in from the window there. Then I think I'm gonna wash that in first. It's a very subtle blue coming in right there. Touches of a yellow, alizarin. I'm doing that area first because it seems to be a lighter area, where generally my strategy is lights to darks. Blotting out some extra water. Mix up my orange and go right into that. And it's already sort of neutral a little bit because of the nature of the two pigments that I mixed together. See if that's a little bit more yellow for that reflected area of the shadow of the orange, and then we're going to go in with the more darker, cooler orange later. That should be okay, yeah. This blue area is still a little bit wet, which is good. It'll create that soft edge where it transitions into that reflection from the left side. putting down now is going to serve as that reflected area in the shadow of the orange. It's a little bit of reflected light you can see just above this blueberry in the orange in the still life. Careful. I gotta be mindful of how much time I have, with things drying, but at the same time try to go as slow as possible given the drying time in this situation. And I want to do some wet into wet washes in this area, so having to talk in paint took me a while to get used to that, so usually I'd be just thinking to myself right now rather than talking, but I just added a little bit more yellow ochre into this orange mixture because there's a little bit of bounce light, reflecting light into this peel where it warms up just a touch, so that's why I just mix that in. Every couple of seconds I'm looking back at my setup. There it gets a little bit darker, a little bit of a cooler orange. I'm going to mix up a bit of a cooler orange, a little bit more of the alizarin is in this mixture now. I'm going to come in. It's still damp here, so it creates that soft edge, that soft, subtle transition. Up a little bit. This I'm going to let it I'm going to get a damp brush, just water, and let this bead of paint right here just blend a little bit into that shadow because we have that orange reflection there anyway. So it's just kind of pumping up that shadow. But I don't want any pigment in my actual brush. It's just water to pull down the pigment that's already there. That way it doesn't go overkill with too much orange going into this shadow. Bring a little bit of that over to here. And then we'll soften these edges. I'm going to do something similar over on that left side. Still probably a little damp. Yeah, it is. And then again with water on my brush, nothing but water, blotting out the excess, I'm going to just wash into that area that had the blue to soften that edge, and we'll still have that subtle blue there, but it'll be like the reflecting color from the outside window as opposed to turning the orange into a blue object. The blue object is the blue I put in now is serving as that cool reflection. I'm going to transition into my smaller brush now. I'm going to start by lifting out, make it a little bit wet, I shouldn't say lifting out, blotting out a little bit of this excess in the shadow. It's still wet here. And I just took it and I just twisted it to get the shape I want. A little bit of coolness right here, so I'll drop in a little bit of blue. Okay. I'm going to let that dry before I do anything else. I'm going to go into the top of this orange, which shifts a little bit more towards a yellowish orange because it's getting warmer, and this area is catching light up here on this top of the peel. Small brush, I'm going to go in and reinforce while it's still wet some of those soft edge, darker areas of this shadow. And working at the top, letting it kind of work its way down because of gravity. I'm going to let that dry before I do anything else. And while I'm doing that, I got some warmer oranges, more shifting more towards yellow over in this area. So I've got basically this cool area of the orange with the little bit of the red into it, and it gradually transitions into this area that has more of the yellow in it, so the warmer spot. So I'm just shifting it back and forth, warm to cool, as I need, because my intensity range in this mixture seems to be okay. Now we'll go in and these areas of the light area of the orange, control inside of it. And that first pass I did with the yellow ochre at the very beginning, I'm just letting that show through as the lighter area of the inside of the orange. So I'm just drawing around. There's a shadow area on some of this area, but I'm going to deal with that cool wash over later, so I'll talk about that when I get to it. Warmer up towards the top. So as the light is changing, as the value shifts from one area to the next, the temperature is also shifting. So every time there's a change in form, there's a change in temperature. The question is, to what degree? How far is that shift in temperature? Slightly warmer, slightly cooler. There can be a shift in intensity as well, so I want to always keep that in mind. As the form's changing, is what kind of shift of intensity is it causing? Is it causing a noticeable shift, or is the intensity shift so subtle that it can be omitted? Just adding some yellow over here to warm this up a little bit more. Edge. And that point right there catches light and it's warmer. So I'm going to let that dry before I do anything else to it. And actually there's one little thing I do want to do. I'll let that dry. I'm going to go work into the blueberries. In fact, but now that I have the orange out, I might come into here. Just with a damp brush, pull gradation, almost like a small little graded wash right there. Put it down, and then I just pulled it with the damp brush. Same thing for this one over here. There's orange reflection. I'm going to bump up another passive orange reflection in the shadow. That peel, same thing over here. While that's drying, we're going to go into the darker areas of the blueberries, which is a blue that is shifting more towards the violet direction. That might be too much water I put down. So we're mixing up just alizarin and the Prussian blue, just making a little bit of a neutral violet, because the green, again, that blue has a shift towards green in the undertone, which is the complement of the alizarin, which is a red. Yeah, that's what I want. Cooler blue, so we'll start with this one here. Let me zoom in so it's a little easier for you to see the small. And this area is already dry, so it's a little easier for me to get these specific edges now. Wash over this darker area of the shadow. Now I just have pure water. I'll push around what's already there to soften the edges, add some gradations as needed. Neutralize that shadow again. I'll drop in another orange in this shadow another time too as well. Leave that there and we'll go to those two. Drop in a little more of that reflected orange. We'll let that dry. And then zoom out, we'll go to the other blueberries while the orange is still drying. Same approach, basically. Let me do that there. So I'm doing the same thing I'm doing with the blueberries, the same fundamental idea that I was using for the others. A cool side, a warm side, that neutral shadow. Some areas here and there have a orange reflection into them. Right there, that needs to be lifted out, but I'll lift out that little extra area later. Because I don't want to lift it out now and have what I'm painting bleed right into the wet area. Looks like that area might need some lifting out, but we'll get to that later. Little kind of red spots, orange spots on that blueberry. kind of like with just graded washes. I'm putting this down and then I'm going back with just water on the brush and pulling it around, the paint around. I do that more intense area of the blueberry than that neutral shadow. Right there. The shadows over on this side don't really have the orange reflection in them the way the ones closer to the orange did. So you can kind of see I've done these blueberries on a couple of stages. I washed in that blue initially. After it dried, I went over and I'm doing these other passes. Same thing's happening with some of the shadows. So remember, gauge things and get an assessment of your subject matter. And some cases you need to do wet into wet, like we've done with some of the areas of shadow and parts of that orange. Other areas, you do a pass, you let it dry, and then you do another pass on it. And if you go into it knowing that you have to have a strategy, it makes the whole process a lot more manageable, as opposed to wanting an instant result. So a little bit of a little red spot, orangish red spot right there on the blueberry. We'll get to this last one. I'll let these blueberries dry, and then I'm going to go back in and push the shadow a little bit as needed. In the meantime, I'm going to work back into this orange. First thing I'm going to do is there's an area of shadow right here I'm going to paint on top of. I'm going to mix up some of this, take a little bit of this neutral blue, just with a thin wash. Collecting some of this shadow. It's coming in. speckles into this area here with some shadow. Some parts peek into light. I think it's a little more neutral, which is why this blue is being used. And then I'm going to go into this area of the orange again. Shadow area. Clean out the brush, and like I did before, just soften that edge as I go around. Same thing to the other side of it. Drop in a little bit of yellow ochre for that warm reflection right there. Basically part of that lighter bouncing off of the paper that this still life is set up on. Bled a little bit into there. Lift that up. When it's dry, I'm going to hit that shadow again. Another pass here. Dropping a little bit of blue reflection back into this area. I might lift out later, but we'll kind of deal with that or make that assessment a little bit later on. And right now I'm just taking just a minimal amount of waters in the mixture right now. And it's kind of like I did in the last demo. I'm taking off the excess and almost dry brushing, which like I say is more like just using a damp brush, not so much a dry, but where I can get more concentrated pigment and almost like I'm hatching it on. So I just want to add a little bit of water, but not too much. I just spray it. It's a little bit more in control. I'm going to zoom in so you can see what I'm doing a little bit more. I have a concentrated amount on the end of this brush. I'm using the Sable round brush. I think I'm going to do now, do one more wash in this area of the orange. I'm going to go in with, do something real quick to the shadows of the blueberries, do a little bit with the watercolor pencil, and then we'll be done with it. Just going to push those neutral shadows of the blueberries, those darker areas. Need to do the same thing with the shadow underneath the orange as well, which I'll do in a second. Orange neutral, cool neutral orange underneath where it's touching the tabletop with the paper on it. Do one more pass in some of those shadow areas of the blueberry itself too. Remember, keep in mind, some areas you get done in one or two passes, others take several passes. As the painting progresses, you kind of see what needs more attention. That's what I mean by saying let the painting tell you what it needs. See other relationships that need adjustment as it moves forward. Oops. I cannot get another camera on that. bit of a darker, warmer shadow on some of this orange peel, that reflection. That shadow up by that peel there. Alright, so I think I'm going to use some colored pencil and then we're going to call this done. So again, you don't have to use the colored pencil. It is just an option. Let me grab it real quick. So I'm going to use 3 colored pencils similar to the limited palette we have. There's one that is called Golden Ochre. It's kind of like yellow ochre that we pulled from. This one's called Light Carmine, which is sort of like the alizarin. And then we have what's called Light Cobalt, which is somewhat similar to we were using a blue. Okay. And I sharpen these the way I do normal pencils. And actually, I'm going to lift out that one little spot there before I jump in with the colored pencil. I noticed that earlier. Lift it out as much as it will come out. Maybe we'll just draw around that spot. So I'm going to start in some areas, the cooler areas of the orange. And I want to do this right now when the painting is dry. There are, and just as a reminder, I can put down something, and if I feel like I want it to be washed over, this is the advantage of the watercolor pencil. Let me wait for that truck to pass. Okay, I think the garbage truck's gone now, so let me just put this down. And again, a little bit of water on the brush. I think I demoed this during the supply demo. But if I needed to, I can always go back over it. And this pencil, the watercolor pencils are water soluble. So you can see you sort of get a wash in there. Not the same as if you put down with the brush, obviously, but it's there if you need to. But right now I'm waiting till this is dry because I just want to kind of clarify a few areas. This cooler area down here. Subtle core shadow. It was kind of cooler anyway, just hatching over. And the reason I'm using watercolor pencils is that I don't want to use a pencil that is not water soluble, because if I decide to put some water down or paint down, if I use a different kind of colored pencil, it's going to resist the paint. Watercolor pencil will not resist the paint, but standard colored pencils will, because they're wax-based, and wax doesn't accept the water. These, however, are water-soluble, so they will accept it. And if you're not sure what they're going to do, test them out. Do a little test area. Warmer areas with this yellow ochreish color. And you could, always do something like this by mixing up a dry brush mixture with your paint the way I'd done it a little while ago. Just would probably be a little more time consuming, but it wouldn't be wrong by any means. But like I say, this is something I'm doing at the end of the painting. Don't think this is the savior for everything. I think sometimes people misunderstand that. They try to use watercolor pencil for everything if they struggle with the painting, but the thing that's holding this together is all the passes of watercolor where I've adjusted. And right here, because of the little bleed, I'm going to let this kind of blend into one big shadow of the blueberry. I'm going to do a quick pass of a violet mixture there. And maybe try to lift out a touch there, and then I'll be done with it. Because that area of reflection in the shadow is a little bit lighter. Not a lot, but enough to want me to lift out a little bit. And then I want to do a quick kind of violetish mixture right along the edge of that shadow right there. I'm going to drop in a little bit of alizarin because it goes from that cooler edge of the shadow slightly to the warmer reflection. I'm going to go back over this with a damp brush. And maybe right here I'm going to see. Dry this off really good. I will leave that as is. I was going to lift out a little bit of extra paper, but I don't think it's even necessary right there. You got the idea of the complementary colors, that cool reflection that's coming in, the red, the orange reflections in the shadow, the warm blue versus the cool blue in the blueberry, those warm reflections that are bouncing into the cast shadows. So basically, set up a still life. It's a complementary setup. Make sure to have a dominant color as opposed to a subdominant. This one, the orange, was the large dominant. The blueberry was the subdominant. Three objects is the minimum, but if you want to go more than three, that's fine. Obviously, I went more than three in this one. You're going to do two paintings, one on hot press paper and one on cold press paper. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions about this painting at all. Okay.